I'm Steve Wiggins, and this is the Groundworks Ministries podcast. Today we're reading from the book of 1 Samuel chapter 14. Let's focus on verses 6 and 7. Jonathan said to the attendant who carried his weapons, "Come on, let's cross over to the garrison of these uncircumcised men. Perhaps the Lord will help us." Nothing can keep the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few. His armor-bearer responded, "Do what is right in your heart. You choose. I'm right here with you, whatever you decide." You know, it'd be hard to make the case that Jonathan's faith was a product of his environment. His circumstances were not those that foster faithful optimism. Saul was his dad. Consider the leaders in Jonathan's life. Saul is sitting around when he should have been faithfully advancing in battle. But he cannot be reassured that he would win any battle because his kingship has been rejected by the Lord. Saul is getting spiritual guidance by a guy named Ahijah, whose priestly line has been rejected by the Lord. Ever since Samuel left, Saul then has no prophetic direction. A rejected king getting advice from a rejected priest. So, what kind of vital optimism can the people of Israel receive from such a king and such a priest? And then Jonathan decides it's time for action. To understand the depth of Jonathan's faith, it helps to understand the images surrounding the path that he took to victory. 1 Samuel 14, verses 4 and 5. There were sharp columns of rock like teeth on both sides of the path that Jonathan intended to cross to reach the Philistine garrison. One was named Bozez, and the other was named Seneh. One stood in the north of Michmash, and the other stood at the south in front of Gega. The Hebrew names of these rocks translate as slippery, Bozez, and thorny, Seneh. So this is hardly a scenic and leisurely hike that Jonathan and his armor-bearer took. It was the worst vantage point for a battle to be trying to fight uphill in rocky, thorny, and slippery conditions. Most folks would consider their route to victory impassable. Basically, nothing on Jonathan's circumstantial radar screen encouraged optimism. And yet, Jonathan's response to his conditions was not to rely on optimism. It was to rely on faith in something which can always be trusted, God's Word. Some people are naturally positive and optimistic, but faith transcends optimism. Faith instructs us to expect a positive outcome even when there is no reason for optimism. Faith prevails in such situations because faith looks not to circumstances, faith looks to God. Jonathan is not trusting in his own daring scheme. He doesn't say, perhaps the Lord will act for us because we're clever or because we're brave. If anything, his daring is an expression of his trust in the Lord. And yet the beauty of Jonathan's faith is in its imagination. He says, "Come on, let's cross over." And the beauty of his imagination is in its balance, in the word perhaps. Now, many believers in our day think that to say perhaps God will is an assault on God's sovereignty, that it cuts to the nerve of faithfulness to say perhaps. You should just say, "No, God will, and I claim it." But that's because we're taught that faith must be certain, that faith has to be dogmatic and absolutely positive in its assumption that God will do what we expect for Him to do, or what we want for Him to do. But because we cannot fathom our suffering would be a function of God's grace, that our suffering would be part of His plan, then we often leave out the perhaps part. You see, faith, therefore, often becomes confused with arrogance. Perhaps is humble. The word perhaps confesses the power of the Lord, and yet it humbly acknowledges our ignorance of the wisdom of His plan. So perhaps retains the Lord's freedom to act according to His will and not ours. Perhaps enables us to step out in faith while prohibiting us from sprinting in pride. Are you facing a difficult season right now? Many of us are. Is the same enemy taunting you like an army of Philistines? Well, salvation begins faith that is willing to say, perhaps the Lord will act for us. Daniel chapter 3, verses 16 through 18. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If that is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, and there's your perhaps statement, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up. That should be our attitude in our generation. Hey, we serve the God of the great perhaps, but nevertheless, we're not bowing down to this world or its idols. I'm Steve Wiggins, and this is the Groundworks Ministries podcast. Groundworks Ministries operates entirely through the financial donations from faithful people like you. And if you're being ministered to through the Bible teaching of Groundworks Ministries, and you would like to help us reach this generation with the gospel, would you consider donating to Groundworks Ministries today? Donating is secure and easy at our website. Check us out at groundworksministries.com.